Deer Creek. It's not Deer Creek GIS.
It's Deer Creek Resources.
Deer Creek Resources. I've known Zeke for quite a few years now, and we have some connections through the GIS world, the mapping of fire resources. And all I'll say is Zeke is just not only just brilliant in terms of making the map part of it, the job, but I think really having a deep understanding of kind of cultural impacts of fires through time, impacts of the climate, impacts of the he's local, so in the sense Northern California, so really thinking about local topography, and he'll talk about all that. He's also a Chico State alumni from the geography department. So
I am too.
Thanks for coming.
All right, thank you. We get late.
Yeah.
All right, I want to start off by asking, are there any foresters in the room? Forest fire and foresters. Okay, I'm not a licensed forester, but I'm going to talk about forestry. And this is a critical view of forestry in California. And I just want to start off by saying that it's really hard to become a forester in California. There's no one who's a forester in California who hasn't really worked hard to get there. So while I'm criticizing in my talk forestry as practiced in California, I'm going to talk a lot about it. I'm not criticizing foresters per se. I'm going to kind of provide a kind of critical view of the ways that we practice forestry in California and the ways that they impact how we found ourselves in this real crisis of wildfire. And traditionally, when we talk about wildfire, when we look at how you understand wildfire, a real common way is to look at hazard and risk. Those are kind of two ways of breaking down the conversation. Hazard is is the condition that creates a problem. High hazard would be lots of fuel and dry weather and wind. And risk is kind of more what insurance companies think of what's the likelihood that something bad is going to happen. And so we've got two ways that fires get started. They're started by humans and they're started by God. And humans start a lot of fires. There's kind of a real clear correlation between the number of people on a landscape and the number of fires that get started. And then humans also, we have to protect what's out there built by humans. And so when you look at preventing fires, Smokey the Bear doing his job, there's a lot that we can do to prevent human ignitions because they're kind of knowable. If we look at a landscape like this is Plumas County, we've mapped all the fire ignitions that firefighters went to over about 30 years. And you can see they're clustered along the highways. There's hardly any way out in the backcountry. There's miles and miles out in the backcountry that there's been no human ignitions at all. There's not many people out there to start fires. Railroads start fires, power lines start fires, but they all kind of follow these major corridors. But lightning doesn't really care anything about pattern or landscape. And so you can see we've got this real variety across this whole landscape of lightning-caused fires. Some places have had 10. A lot of places, almost everywhere out there has had at least one. So we can prevent human ignitions, but Smokey the Bear really can't do anything about lightning. And then it's cutting off all my slides. I'm not sure what we can do about that. But when we have big lightning storms, often they start a lot of fires. And so we've got this great kind of fire suppression system in place in the state where, if there's a fire on a given day in Butte Creek Canyon, within like 15, 20 minutes, you can have 5 air tankers there. And so fire doesn't really have a chance. So when we talk about hazard, we're looking at the landscape condition and the weather, and it's kind of the potential for damage. So you can have a high hazard of fire happening, but if there's not homes there that we're worried about burning up, or timber we're worried about burning up, really, then the hazard drops in kind of relative importance. But hazard is what we use to kind of look at where to put fire stations, how many air tankers to have on standby, etc. And hazard is something that we can manage up to a point. So this is a real typical kind of Western Sierra fuel type where we've got tan oak and ponderosa pine and real thick. And so you can come in there and you can mow all that with a big machine and make it look like this, and the hazard goes down. But then it, 5 years later, it might look like that again. the foothills here are one of the most productive places in the world, really, for growing vegetation. Now, when we look at, in forestry, we talk about site class and how well an area will grow trees, and site class 1 is kind of considered to be the best. Well, Paradise and Cohasset and Forest Ranch, they're site class 1A, because they're better than the best. So we kind of, in the foothills here and all through California, we have this kind of perfect transition from the grass into this kind of brush zone and then up into the timber. And even though this is hot and dry and has a ton of fuel, like I said before, Chico has one of the bigger air tanker bases in the state. And they're just really effective under almost all weather conditions. If you've got 5 big air tankers, we're going to put out a fire that's burning in Butte Creek Canyon or below Paradise. And so we kind of staff up to manage. There's a point of diminishing returns with how much money you spend on firefighting versus the effectiveness. And so, you know, we could spend 100 times more money on firefighting and we could have, you know, 10 times as many big super tankers, but we're not going to put out 97% of fires. You know, it doesn't matter. There's just kind of this threshold at which it doesn't matter how many air tankers you have, how many bulldozers, how many crews. The fires are going to do what they want. And unfortunately, when that happens, and this is my only campfire slide, we've got a ton of places in the state that have the same exact problems as Paradise do. But Paradise, you know, you couldn't build a better system for, like, you couldn't design this better if you're trying to design a place to trap and kill people during a bad wildfire event. And so, in my job as a geographer, you know, I look at, right now we have an opportunity to really try a new approach in Paradise, but that would mean we've got 10,000 lots out here that all belong to someone, and we would need to buy them all up, or buy up 2/3 of them, and reshuffle the ownership. But there was no planning in Paradise. It was just, how many times can I subdivide this piece of property without doing an EIR? So, as zoned, most of the state is like this. You know, all around Grass Valley, Nevada City, Colfax. Anywhere that you've got kind of brush transitioning into ponderosa pine, transitioning into cedar, has been a great place to build homes for people that want to get out of the valley and up into the cool places in the summer. But really, until we deal with kind of structural issues of all these small private lots, you know, these lots, a lot of these lots are 50 feet across, and trees grow so well in Paradise that in 30 years, a tree that just started today is going to be 50 feet tall. So once that tree is too tall for you to fall on your property without taking out your neighbor's fence, you've got to call a tree service, and that's going to cost, you know, between $1,000 and $2,000 per tree. And there's a lot of trees. So that's just one of the problems. But for us to really meaningfully reduce the hazard in a place like Paradise, we've got to treat really large areas. Because this fire, and these are little spot fires here, and then the bright yellow is burning buildings. There's an infrared satellite image. But when fires are hopscotching around like that, you've got to treat everything. Because a fire that burns up out of the canyon and spots all over town, it doesn't really matter if you've got a, you know, half-mile wide fuel break on the top. That could have all been a giant parking lot. And the fire still would have jumped over Paradise and took it out. So as a geographer, what we use is, what I want to talk about mainly today is about the landscape scale picture. And there's things about any place on the landscape that affect how fires are going to behave there. So in the case of Paradise and Concal, we've got the North Fork Feather River, and it's the largest watershed in the Sierra Nevada. And it actually starts on the east side of the crest. And so at night, all the cold air from this 2,200 square mile area all drains down just like water. And the whole watershed pinches right down to this point right here, which is basically Pulga and Big Bend Mountain. So all that air just pours down every night over Concal. This is Concal Basin down here, Lake Concal. And it wind kind of packs up here and spills out through Paradise, or through Concal. And so in July, in 2008, we had lightning fires all over Butte County. And then a backfire got lit along the road above Concal. And it just ripped down in and took out Concal the first time. But when you looked at the data from when that happened, this is like every single night we've got sustained 10 to 15 mile an hour winds with gusts to 30 miles an hour. So we just know that about this place on the landscape is that this happens every summer, every night. Anyone who lives up there knows that this happens. So we can anticipate we're going to have screaming fires that come through Concal. All we need is an ignition, and we can't manage ignitions. There's going to be a power line, there's going to be a car broken down, there's going to be someone barbecuing. There's something's going to start a fire, and we just know it's like a floodplain. So this is, we're going to talk a little bit about fuels, because a lot of what we talk about on the landscape scale is like, how can we change the fuels on the landscape scale? How can we, if we're worried about, since we know we can't manage ignitions, traditionally fuels manage themselves with lightning fires and with Native American burning. So these, a lot of what we, since we can't go out and map every stick and we can't count every tree and every bush, we kind of look at what are some other metrics we can use to kind of generalize about fuels. One way we can do it is we can look at where we've had past fires. So this is 10 years after the 2008 fires. This is pretty much the summer before last. This is right where the fire kind of ripped up out of the Feather River and came into Concal. But we've got 10-year-old dead trees, we've got 10-year-old brush, we've got 10-year-old dead brush, we've got a ton of grass. So jumping in, kind of, so we're talking fuels, talking forestry, and land managers have been using fire to manage lands for thousands of years. What happened about 100 years ago was the Forest Service got formed and people really were interested in Douglas fir in the Klamath Mountains. So we've been burning for community wildfire safety around in the Klamath Mountains. And working a lot with the Karuk people over there, and they've been burning forever, but they didn't care much about Doug fir because they weren't trying to sell lumber and they weren't running sawmills. So they managed for tan oak. But the Forest Service came in and cut down as much of the big trees as they could haul out. And then they actually sprayed herbicide to kill the tan oak. Now we're getting back to a rhythm over there where the native people are starting to get more burning done. But, you know, really with a more emphasis on managing for oaks. And when I look at, you know, Paradise and Forest Ranch and Cohasset, you know, a lot of what we call fuel reduction over the last 50 years, I think we could call it oak restoration. Because one of the big problems we have with fire suppression is that we've got all these conifers, like Doug fir and cedar, that come up through the oaks and they shade them out. And without frequent fire, we've lost a lot of our oak woodlands, but the oaks are way less flammable than the conifers. And so I see all these bumper stickers for, you know, Paradise Strong and Ridge Strong and everything. It's all got this pine tree on there. But it's like, well, what did the ridge look like 150 years ago? Was it a lot more oaks? And if we're going to plant trees in the campfire area, should we plant pine trees, which are the ones that burn really intensely and throw these flammable needles everywhere? Or should we be planting oaks that provide food for people, for turkeys, for deer? But kind of coming back to this idea that there's metrics that we want to use to understand fuel loading across the landscape. Historic land management or historic timber harvest is a really useful way to understand the condition of land today. And so logging's been a big part of Butte County's history since the gold rush. Originally there was a flume that started up in Butte Meadows and it came all the way down through Upper Park. That's why there's a flume street in Chico downtown. It's because flume actually came down right into downtown Chico, and they would float half-milled logs down and they would cut them up down in the valley, so it's easier to send logs down. But so we know that, you know, we've been actively logging up in the mountains here since like the 1870s or earlier. And by the so it got really mechanized in the 30s and 40s, and we had like full-on railroad grades. If you drive around up in foothills here, all the like the A line, the B line, C line, the F line, the H line, these roads that you see, those are all old railroad lines. And then the spurs were places that you would like push a bunch of cars up the hill and bring them back down full of logs. But what these photos can tell us is like, okay, so this is Bull Creek and Upper Butte Creek watershed. And they'd already logged this, and then the slash from all this logging caused intense fires. And some of those places haven't come back in conifers at all, they've come back in oaks. But there's these clues that you see in these old photos, like someone took this photo because they're interested in trains, and there's a book out because someone's interested in trains, but I'm interested in fuels. And there's a lot of information there about what was happening. And one thing I see there is there's a lot of small trees. And so by the time we were logging with trains, we'd already been logging with donkeys and steam engines and everything for 70 years. And so there's already second growth. And so up in Sterling City, they actually built a whole sawmill to cut second growth in the 60s because they'd been logging for 100 years. They had all kinds of small trees already. So all that stuff gives you clues as to what's happened before, and we can look at ownership patterns and say like, okay, well the national forest got logged later, so if we're worried about overdense stands, maybe the private lands in general have different problems or issues than the Forest Service lands. But what I found useful over time is like, if I'm gonna look at a chunk of land and try to figure out how the hazard is, the condition is, if I can figure out, okay, how was this logged? This was logged 30 years ago. Did they cut all the big trees out? Did they thin it? Did they clear cut it? There's a lot of data out there on that now. And we can use that data to kind of start to look at the landscape scale and understand, hey, where are places we can actually meaningfully affect changes in the fuels? So I worked on some fires last summer up in Shasta County, and they really kind of hammered home some big picture problems we have with land ownership patterns and so what I want to talk about because we're going to talk about landscape scale fire. When a fire gets large, like the Camp Fire or the Carr Fire or the Hurst Fire, any of these big ones you hear about, as firefighters we have to kind of back off and pick a strategy using the ridge tops and the rivers and the roads. But it's kind of this big box idea where we can't, these fires that are just running, the 95 percentile fire that gets away and is now 5,000 acres, we're probably not going to put it out at 6,000 acres as long as the wind's blowing and it's in a place that's not favorable. We can't engage firefighters directly fighting fires in steep canyons with poor access. We've gotten really good at killing firefighters over the last 100 years. And so one impact of that is that it really has affected the way that the agencies pick their tactics. But we've got these kind of imaginary lines out here, these ownership boundaries. This is called checkerboard, and every other section there is owned by private owners versus the Forest Service. And that's a legacy of railroad building in the 1800s. So some of you probably heard about this. As the surveyors moved west and chopped up the whole landscape into sections, if you build a railroad, you got a section on either side. You got checkerboard section ownership like 6 miles out from the main line. And then if you had enough pull, you could oftentimes get farther out. So there was all these major railroads like Union Pacific and the Western Pacific. Most of them went bankrupt multiple times during the course of building the railroad across the country or building the railroad at the West Coast. And so they were always trying to like, hey, we're bankrupt, we need more land, whatever. But they ended up with all this checkerboard, which is pretty much a nightmare to manage because the private timber landowners, their objective is to make money off their land, and if they have investors, to make their investors happy. And the Forest Service is supposed to manage for watershed health, they're supposed to manage for fisheries, they're supposed to manage for recreation, all these things. And that's a conflict because a lot of the fires that we've had, these large fires, are actually beneficial to the landscape. So we work on fires in northwestern California around Hay Fork or out in the Klamath Mountains, and oftentimes when we map the severity of the fire afterwards, it's like only 20 or 30% of the fire burns with a high severity, and 60 or 70% burns with low to moderate severity, which is a lot like what we'd want if we did a prescribed fire. And so the Forest Service knows this, and oftentimes when we have these big fires, there's multiple other fires going on in the region anyway, so they have to kind of triage, and they're not going to send, 5 heavy air tankers and 5 heavy helicopters and 20 hotshot crews to a fire that's really doing good in the backcountry. They're going to go save Redding or save Paradise. But just like Paradise has got all these small lots that create kind of an impossible management situation, this checkerboard really creates an impossible management situation in the national forest. This is going up Highway 80, and the reason we have checkerboard on Highway 80 is because the Transcontinental Railroad came through Donner Summit just like Highway 80. And so most of the Tahoe National Forest has this checkerboard pattern, which almost all the private lands owned by companies like Sierra Pacific Industries, and the public lands Forest Service for the most part. Here's a map of clear cuts in the past 20 years in California, and you can see that checkerboard pattern all through here. Most of the clear cuts kind of from here over are the handiwork of Sierra Pacific Industries, SPI. They've got about 2 million acres in California. So this checkerboard ownership, here's a fire that burned in 2012, and then it was salvage logged after that. And so the private land, they pretty much cut just about everything that was out there. They had already done some clear cuts before that, but their land did burn hot. They cut everything. Forest Service got sued because people like to sue about salvage logging, often for good reasons. Often salvage logging is kind of the worst thing you can do ecologically. Sorry, it's cutting off the captions here. But kind of just I want to show you guys tools that we can use to kind of look at the big picture. So there's a new satellite that's European Space Agency. It's the Sentinel satellite, and it's higher resolution than Landsat, but it's kind of got a lot of similar wavelengths that it looks at. But there's this cool website where you can download their imagery and play with it, and one of the products they have is surface moisture estimate. And I thought this was great because, you know, we know intuitively from like when you walk from a forest into a clear cut, it's hot and dry in a clear cut, and you want to go back in the shade and eat your lunch. You don't want to sit out in the clear cut. But this actually kind of gives you a bigger picture view of like, hey, like these clear cuts are basically turning shady, deep forest into upper park temporarily. Then trees grow in and it cools down, there's more shade. But this is important at a landscape scale because, you know, this deep dark forest here, it might not be ready to burn till July or August. But this might be ready to burn in the second week of April if it's sunny. And this might, once you get some rain in the winter, this might just be out and not burn at all. But this here might burn after 2 weeks of winter sunshine. So I think it's, you know, interesting to look at the bigger picture, and it's like, how are these land management practices affecting the overall hazard, the overall condition of the entire forest? So just a little more on this particular piece of ground, and this is kind of between Bernie and Mount Shasta. So this is 2012, right before the fire. And so this land was already clear cut, and when you put in a clear cut, the sun can really get into the edges all around the clear cut. So it dries out the immediate area with no shade, but it also dries out that whole area. And so salvage logging, you get these exemptions from timber harvest rules, and you can get a lot done. So a lot of times they're like, hey, if it's, you know, tree looks like it's going to die at all, we're going to take it out. We wanted to like put new trees in here anyway. So what I think is interesting is this all burned, right? But the public land, it just crept around. You can see there's little hot pockets in here. This shady stuff here didn't really even burn at all. So the management practices before the fire had a lot to do with how the fire behaved. Here's another look at it. After the fire, it's like, yeah, it burned hot in some places, but cooler, shady areas, there's still, you know, big trees there. We'll come back to this and talk about some prescribed fire. This is in the car fire. We worked on the car fire. So I guess one thing I didn't mention is I started a company about 10 years ago to do GIS mapping during wildfires. But I worked for a company before that, kind of right out of school, for about 10 years doing mapping on large wildfires. So we go to the fire camps and we make the maps for the firefighters. And we've done about 180 major fires in the last 20 years. And in that time, we've done 10 of the 20 most destructive fires in the state. But we're also kind of, most of the maps are just kind of topographic maps and with fire lines and stuff like that. But we're also kind of always looking at what are some other information that we can throw in there to help the firefighters understand the hazard. So this is the car fire before the fire happened, and there was a bunch of clear cuts out there that were all full. You can see they're all just full of slash. Slash is all the kind of branches and pine needles and everything that are left after you take out the trees. And so these clear cuts are dry, but they're also full of kindling. And so then during the car fire, there was a ton of effort put in building a big dozer line up here. Pretty much like after the third or fourth day of the car fire, you could look at a map and know that the fire was going to be larger than 150,000 acres. I sent Henry an email because I wanted to be able to brag later when the fire was like 30,000 acres. And I'm like, oh, this thing's going over 150,000 for sure. That's just based on looking at where we can put bulldozers, where we're going to be able to fire out. You have to get way ahead of these big fires because it takes days and days to prepare these ridges. And so what we tried to do on this fire was put a dozer line up the county line road, because that was the logical place. But it's really hard to hold a dozer line when it's 105 degrees out and it's raining embers into these huge piles of kindling. So had this not all been clear cut and full of slash, it's likely that the fire would have stopped here on this huge dozer line that got put in. But instead it just it just blew right over it. And we're not talking like, this dozer line, was probably, 200 feet across. So anyway, sorry it's getting cut off, but anyway, this is my kind of propaganda slide about why clear cuts are bad for fire, and I'll just talk more about that. On the Hurst Fire, which burned in Shasta County up kind of just by Lakehead, this is timber harvest in white. They're clear cuts in the last 20 years. And then this is national forest out here. This is checkerboard. And a lot of the national forest that hadn't had the logging are just underburned. One of the things that was tough for firefighters on this particular, so they're talking this area out in here. One thing that was really tough on this fire was that the Forest Service has jurisdiction, even though there's checkerboard ownership, we've got these ways we've split up the state into kind of responsibility areas. And the Forest Service, in this case, was responsible for firefighting, even though half the land is protected by CAL FIRE. And so what happened here was the Forest Service decided pretty early on, based on where the fire was and safety and everything else, that, hey, we're going to put in a big ridge-line dozer brakes, and we're going to fire out off this, and it's going to take 10 days, and that's our box. Well, in the timber companies, the people who own this land out here that's clear cut, that's got baby trees on it, that they spent $1,000 per acre getting going, they didn't like that idea. They thought, well, hey, why don't we cut it off here and send inmates down here, and then go up this hill over here and go over there. And so it was really, there's a lot, when you hear the word unified command, which you hear a lot on big fires, that means that everyone's having a really miserable time, and that the governor is calling the fire boss saying, how come you're letting this burn? How come you're not using a smaller box? Or the chief of CAL FIRE, or other people. And so the timber industry pushes for really aggressive firefighting, and CAL FIRE in general has a lot more aggressive firefighting than the Forest Service does. In part because they're using inmates for all the hardest work. And so on this fire, even though the Forest Service had a plan that they were going to fire down this ridge, CAL FIRE decided, well, we're going to send some inmates down, we're going to punch a line down into here. And then we'll hold it up there to give these timber companies enough time to pull the logs out of here that out of this active clear cut. So they put all this effort in. Nearby, the company that Henry and I work for, Firestorm, had crews that were putting in a contingency line out on one of these ridges farther out. And there was a dozer line on the ridge, and our crews were cutting line up to the dozer line. And this rock, the size of like a 4-foot boulder, came down out of the berm, and it hit 2 of our guys and knocked the shit out of them, and they had to get helicoptered out, and they almost died. But they were putting in that contingency line to protect private timberlands. When the fire that was not burning in the log areas was just kind of cruising through doing good work. So it makes it really impossible for us, if I'm going to do a prescribed burn, I don't want to stop the fire like halfway up the hill at a property line. I want to go to the ridge and put in line there and stop the fire where the fire would stop naturally. So we're creating these really unnatural and fire-prone conditions in the woods, and then we're paying for it, right? So firefighting that CAL FIRE is doing is all being paid for by taxpayers, and the timber companies aren't really paying anything. And this tanker, the Ponderosa fire here in Butte County, this was the first time that the 747 flew, so there's like a lot of international media on, hey, the super tankers arrived and saved Fordstown or whatever it was. But that drop cost like $100,000, right? And it was mainly to protect SPI's trees. So I've always kind of felt like, hey, if the timber companies really had to pay, if they had to have their own Air Force, they had to have their own army of bulldozers and inmate firefighters, they probably would have more fire-resilient forests they're creating out there. This kind of example of when we talk about ridgeline dozer, this is what we're talking about. So let's see, just talking about prescribed burning, like what I said before, we want to hold things on ridges, but here it's like So this burned 7 years ago now, and our fire return interval in a lot of our mixed conifer is like 7 to 10 years. So it's a perfect time for us to go out and like burn this again, right? Because you've got all the little dead trees that died in the last fire that need to be cleaned up, and you've got new sprouts that are, you know, tall enough that you can still kill them with a fire. If we wait another 10 years to have a fire in here, we're going to have all these ladder fields. We're going to have like 30-foot tall trees growing up. So it would be a perfect time to run some fire through here, but it's impossible basically to stop a fire on this mid-slope line. If you put anyone out there to try to hold it, they're going to eat a ton of smoke. And if you lose it, it's going to burn up all SPI's little baby trees that are full of grass. And so it's kind of just an impossible condition. The scale at which we need to use prescribed fire on the landscape is massive, and it's pretty much impossible to do it anywhere that we have SPI mixed in, because SPI is really afraid of fire for a good reason, because their forests are incredibly flammable, but also they're really afraid of liability, because one of their contractors started the Moonlight Fire, allegedly, and they got like a $100 million fine. And so pretty much the manager for SPI for this whole part of the state, he manages about 800,000 acres, he's told me, we're not going to do any, as long as I'm in charge here, we're not going to burn piles, we're not going to do prescribed burning. If CAL FIRE wants to come and take on the responsibility, the liability, we'd be glad to have them burn in our fuel breaks, but we're not going to do anything ourselves. But the implications for that are huge, because like this is the issue wilderness here. Here's the top of Cohasset Ridge, Campbellville, Paynes Creek up here, Red Bluff over here. This whole landscape here is like 800,000 acres of grassland and oaks and brush. And the Tehama deer herd is, you know, at times it was the biggest deer herd in the state. So this is the critical kind of habitat for the Tehama deer herd. And so this area really needs to burn. And in the past we've had a lot of fire out here because it's a low priority when there's lightning and there's fires everywhere else. No one lives out here really, so there's been a lot of fire out here, but in the last 20 years, we've been on several fires out here where they bring in those big super tankers and put the fire out. And there's some really unique habitats out here that really need fire. There's these pineries down here that have these really cool open forest structures, really need fire, and it's a perfect place when you think about like reintroducing natural fire in the landscape. It's a perfect place to do it, but this entire landscape here is SPI clear cuts. And so there's really no way to do that. Because it's like I said before, it's just kind of like it's surrounded with piles of kindling. So I want to talk a little bit about just how fuels change. You know, talk about management history being a metric for current condition. Things are always changing. So a 2-year-old clear cut has a different kind of flammability or hazard than a 3-year-old clear cut. This is up above Forest Ranch. So this was cut maybe 2 years ago or last year. It's already been replanted. So they're not going to clean up any more this last year. This kind of meets the CAL FIRE signed off on and said, you know, per the harvest practice rules, like slash has to be locked up and no taller than 18 inches above the ground. And then 7 years later, the trees are, this is the adjacent stand, trees are like 10 to 15 feet tall, and a lot of slash is kind of rotting. But from a fire behavior standpoint, this is really open still, and winds are really the critical thing for firefighting. You know, if the wind can blow on a surface, it's like getting down and blowing on your campfire. That's why we have faster rates of spread in a clear cut. It's not necessarily because there's more fuel there, it's just that it's drier, and the wind can just like blow right in here and fan the fire along. So as long as it's still open, we've got kind of an elevated hazard. At 10 to 12 years old, they like to thin the plantations, but the slash is hard to deal with. It's not economical, it's not worth anything, and so generally it'll just get left in the woods. And SPI is starting to do more grinding it up, like mastications. They go on these giant mowers and shred it. It's still an elevated fuel load, but it's not quite, this is, obviously not great. So kind of on that bigger scale, you can see like, okay, this is an area in Tehama County by Manton that was full, it had just been thinned. And then we had the Ponderosa Fire in 2012, and SPI really started doing their clear cutting about 1997. And so by 2012, they really got started in Tehama County in a big way. Before they really even Butte County has been hit hard the same, but this area, they pretty much pre-commercial thinned all this stuff. So all those clear cuts that are burned were full of that red down slash. And then so they kind of cleaned it all off to start over. But we've got now this 20,000 acre patch of forest land that's all the same age. And so we've got this kind of critical period now. It's like, well, if they can get it to 30 years old or something without it burning up, that's great. But what happens if it burns and then it expands and everything around the edge burns too? So with these big kind of mega fires, we're creating these big patches of even aged hazard, of kind of uniform high hazard across the landscape. Where before, before this was being logged with clear cuts, they were logging it with conventional logging and there was slash and stuff. But it was like there was a lot more variety out there, and you weren't likely to lose 25,000 acres in a single fire. So that's the Ponderosa fire, and then this is that kind of moisture estimates. So what's interesting to me, it's like obviously, yeah, it's a lot drier where there's no shade, but all these younger clear cuts out here, it's like we're just creating more and more proportion of the forested landscape in a hot, dry, high hazard condition.
Zeke, I have a question on that last slide. So because of the scale, so if a fire were to start on one of those smaller spaces, is there not enough of the dark blue moist areas to keep it from spreading in a moderate windstorm? In other words, is the spacing of it also?
Well, I think one of the problems is that they come and they haven't cut this stuff yet. This is all like dense second growth around here. And so they're not doing a lot of management of the stands they haven't clear cut yet. They're like, oh, we're going to clear cut that in 10 years, so we're just going to leave it for now. Where if they were selectively harvesting it all, they'd be paying more attention to the overall condition of the entire thing. So SPI's got tree farms, and then in between they've got these kind of overgrown forests that haven't been touched for a long time. But the problem really with this fire, so this fire we were assigned to it, and I was driving from Chico up to Red Bluff to work on the fire, and it's like the fire was already, it made this whole run pretty much in one afternoon. So I saw this big cloud that was like 7 miles wide of active fire. And similar to the campfire, just under those conditions, the spotting's the issue. So when you've got a plantation that's full of grass and brush and small trees, and then a kind of dry edge, the fire runs across and it spots. It torches up into the tall trees in the next stand, and then it rains embers all over out here. And this is just super receptive because it's unshaded. And so, when you hear, I've been on some fires and heard the air attack saying like, all these spot fires are like 20 acres within 20 minutes. Because it's like, well, there are 20-acre clear cuts everywhere. And so it's pretty much impossible to control fires when they're running like that, because air tankers don't stop spotting. So the pre-commercial thinning, it works sometimes. Like, it's the right thing to do. One of the reasons that we've got so many problems with the clear cuts is that the harvest rules that we've got in the state are based on a history of people cutting down all the trees and running away with the money and not planting. So the forest practice regulations say that you've got to plant a certain number of trees for if you're going to do a clear cut, you got to come back and you got to plant 10 by 10 foot spacing, 400 trees per acre. And that's too many trees. But SPI is really good at growing trees. They're like really good tree farmers. And so they have a really high success rate. But if mom and pop go out and clear their land and then throw a bunch of trees in the ground and only 50% of them survive, you might not have the stocking that is required by law. So CAL FIRE has a hard time saying, well, SPI is good at planting trees, so they only have to plant 200 trees per acre, but mom and pop have to plant 400. But we've kind of legislated ourselves into this pickle. We're planting way too many trees, and then we have to thin them. If we only planted a quarter as many trees, we wouldn't have to thin them. We wouldn't have all the slash from thinning. But on the campfire, a lot of the land that had been pre-commercial thinned wasn't in the direct path of the fire. And some of the stuff got burned on the first day. After the fire was kind of blowing its way, and on the flanks it wasn't moving as fast. So a lot of the trees that had been in areas that had been thinned recently actually survived. But what's kind of mind-blowing to me up in the foothills here is like trees grow so well that you can have in a 20-year-old plantation you can have 35-foot trees. And so thinking of paradise, 20 years from now it's going to be a thicket. Right? And 10 years from now it's going to be, like that. So it's just, this is exact same precip, exact same elevation, everything is paradise and Magalia. So anyway, now we're going to talk a little about more hopeful stuff. I just want to give you the big picture of that pattern of clear cut / pre-commercial thin thick forest is about 1.8 million of acres of the state. That's how SPI is managing their lands. So it's just not a real fire resilient model. So more fun though is the good stuff that we've been doing over on the Klamath Mountains. Karuk people and Yurok people have been using fire to manage their lands for thousands of years, and they've kind of managed to keep doing it. When you look at arson records for the Hoopa Reservation, they say like, wow, Hoopa's got like the highest rate of arson in the state. In the whole country, right? It's like 1,200 human ignitions a year. But that's cultural burning. That's not arson. You know, we don't have very many big fires in Hoopa because the people who are lighting all these fires, they know where not to light. They don't go light the bottom of South Base. You know, they have a cultural wisdom about their what we call arson, but they have retained the knowledge of how to use fire on that landscape. So this is what we were doing last week. This is Tan Oak, and we brought fire down. This is about 20 acres, and we brought fire down through this unit, and then we finished off at the road. But by bringing it down the hill, starting at the top, we're able to burn through here. Our objective here is to kill the small trees, kill a lot of the baby trees that are going to turn us into a fir thicket instead of Tan Oak. And that's the work that's going on over there is a result of like 20 years really of trust building between the local nonprofits, the tribes, and the Forest Service, and a huge amount of analysis. This is really what we call a data-rich environment. And there's another thing we've noticed in kind of traveling around we've worked all over the West in the last 20 years, and there's kind of these data-rich areas, as you guys know, I'm sure from working in the field. And there's other places that are really what we call data poor. Data poor places, you go there and there's not much resource data. One thing in the Klamath Mountains is that when they shut down logging in the Pacific Northwest because of the spotted owl, the Klamath Mountains were included in the Northwest Forest Plan. And so what that meant was that they spent millions and millions of dollars analyzing the ecosystems and building a ton of base data. So coming in as GIS people to a place that has already spent millions and millions of dollars on resource management data, it was a really fun place to work. So what we did is we went over and we took one of our GIS modules, kind of the equipment we take to a fire, and we just did this mapping intensive for about a week over here with this nonprofit. And we'd talk about, they'd kind of gone through a process of deciding what attributes in the ecosystem were important to them. And then we made maps, they'd mark them up, we'd make more maps, and we just kind of built what we call this big overlay analysis. And that helped us to kind of target where to do these prescribed burns. So during these prescribed burning events, we've got these kind of units that they've kind of sketched out, like, hey, this landowner wants to burn this area. And then, so we show up and we send out kind of operational people that know how to do the burning, and kind of break down and say, like, okay, well, there's a car, there's a truck here in the blackberries, you have to put a line around that, or there's an old PVC line or whatever. But the reason we're doing this project here on this part of the landscape, there's been a lot of work to decide this was a priority. So I'm just going to take you through kind of how we approach that. This is Klamath River. The Salmon River comes in right here. This is kind of between Mount Shasta and Arcata. And they wanted to focus on this kind of tan oak mixed evergreen ecosystem, which is in green. We want to look at areas that had recently been burned and needed to be burned again. Elk winter range, so that yellow is like, they're kind of doing a lot of elk restoration there, and elk need the river bottoms to be in healthy condition to spend the winter. Spotted owl, protected activity centers. I don't remember what that was. Black oak and white oak. Tribal management areas, ridge tops. High solar insolation areas, so just areas that are productive to get a lot of sun. The upper third slopes, because these areas are good places to burn in the middle of the winter. Riparian areas, roadside areas, managed timber stands, so plantations that need fire in them. Areas of high predicted fire severity, major access routes, historic fire lines, indigenous trail network. They burned along the major ridges, and the women were actually the ones that did most of the burning for the Karuk tribe when they were out doing collecting. Then the wildland-urban interface, buffers around the individual structures, dense tree plantations. So we stack all that stuff up, and it's just a real mess. But if we score the overlays, we can see, the red is kind of where we've got all the things that really line up. Where we've got urban interface, and elk habitat, and riparian areas, and tan oak. And that, if we drill in, these are the areas that we're targeting for prescribed fire. And the idea about targeting the urban interface and burning right in people's yards is that we really want to be able to manage, let fires, we know we're going to have big fires here anyway, we want to let them burn. Because it's the only time that we're going to get the scale we need. There's no way we're going to get out and do, 25,000 acres of prescribed fire. But a lightning fire is ignited at the perfect time, right? Like, who better to decide when to burn than God, right? Drop a spark on the ridge, let it go. So we want to get to a point where we can let fires burn in the backcountry and the people in town feel safe and they have a relationship with fire where they know that it's their friend. So we're able to burn right in people's yards, basically. One thing I like to tell people about prescribed fire is that CAL FIRE and the Forest Service, we fight fire under the 97th percentile weather conditions all the time. That's when we fight fire. So if you trust us to go out there and put out a fire when it's July, we sure as hell can do it in October when it's 50 degrees and the wind's not blowing. So a lot of what we aim for is kind of light underburns to clean up the forest floor. But some places out there are really thick, and it's really expensive to go in and thin first. And a lot of people say, oh, there's no way we can reintroduce fire without doing all this thinning first because it's been 100 years without fire, everything else. We're actually able, if we burn at night or burn under the right prescriptions, we can burn in these systems and kill a lot of these trees. And I think one thing people need to realize about prescribed fire is that if you're going to come and thin this with chainsaws and feller bunchers and heavy equipment, you would kill thousands of trees. That's your objective. And no one says, oh my God, you killed all these trees. But if we run a fire through here and there's a bunch of dead trees, people are like, oh my God, the Forest Service killed all those trees, those red trees. You see that, man? They burned it too hot. What a bunch of idiots. It's like, no, we wanted to kill those trees. That was the whole point. So this is success in this particular burn. Like, we wanted to kill that big tree. Like, we wanted 100-foot flame lengths because this is a prairie. And it's historically been a prairie. It's really important for the elk. And it's not a prairie right now because fire suppression is allowing all these cedar and Doug fir to grow into it. But our objective here was to, hey, let's try to get some prairie back in there. So CAL FIRE is really starting to get back on board. One of the big obstacles we've had to burning on private lands is that CAL FIRE, people retire at 50. And CAL FIRE's prescribed burning kind of fell apart about 20 years ago. So that means that there's no one in their agency under 30 who's on any prescribed burning really on the clock. So this burning we're doing in the Klamath, this is all being done through the Nature Conservancy and the Fire Learning Network. And it's prescribed fire training exchanges. There's kind of a global network of prescribed fire training exchanges. And the goal is to build capacity for managing fire and doing prescribed fire. And it's actually helping us now to train CAL FIRE people because the capacity is being built. We haven't been able to just wait for them to get their act together. So now they're coming out and we're training them and we're helping them rebuild their prescribed fire training program. Anyway, over there it's grassroots and it's fun to be part of and it's encouraging. And all those obstacles we talked about, it's still, when you say, oh, we can't burn on SPI land or we can't burn in checkerboard, there's still a lot of opportunities to get really good fire on the ground. There's good things happening locally in Butte County. And a big part of this is kind of reinvigorating a cultural connection with fire. It's if you get people to thin their own lot and burn piles, they come to recognize the utility of fire. And until we can rebuild that trust and that relationship with fire, we're not going to be able to do anything because people are petrified, especially after the campfire. So I feel like the challenge for all of us moving forward is like, we got to reinvigorate our connection with fire. We have to be open to using it, and we have to also understand that it's beyond our control. And we're going to have it one way or another. So we can have it under the conditions that we want, or we can take our chances with it in the summer when it's windy. So that's what I got. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for some questions.
Good.
Just more of a comment. Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, sir, they're doing some prescribed burns very soon, and if not October, maybe November. Were you aware of any of those?
I've been hearing about them.
Yeah. So I think well, Eli Goodsell, and they always invite if students are interested in them. If you want to see what a prescribed burn is like, look at the BCCER, Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve website for notifications. So they're really push the utility of it.
Have any of you guys taken the power geography class in the geography department? It's Don Hankins teaches it. It's a good class. But if you're interested in learning about prescribed fire, you can talk to Henry or I. We both work for Firestorm. Deer Creek Resources is kind of the geeky arm of Firestorm. But we're really trying to build kind of a private industry prescribed fire powerhouse if we can. And we're always hiring people to do GIS. And we're wanting to build there's a real need for fire scientists. There's a lot of emphasis on cranking out fire ecologists from the UCs and PhDs and researchers, but there's also a real practical need for people who are going to go out and manage forestry projects related to fire and prescribed burning. So keep your ear open for good resources.
Fire burn associations, I heard, I talked to somebody recently at RCD that they might be looking into that. And I know that there's a BC Cooperative Extension workshop coming up.
Yeah.
Can you guys speak to that?
Yeah, Wolfgang Rugel at the RCD here, she came over to the Climate Treks with us last week, and it's burning. So there's a watershed coordinator grant that the RCD is working on, or that they have, to do a prescribed burning cooperative. And so that model is that if you are a landowner and you want to burn and you can bring a truck and tools or a little fire engine or whatever you have, they're trying to build a cooperative where people can get together and help each other burn on private lands.
Yeah, so you can look that up under the Butte County Resource Conservation District.
Yep, you can tell them Wolfie's a neighbor of mine, which is
Okay.
why
You're aware, yeah.
Okay.
So it's called the Prescribed Fire Association, and I mean it's aimed at landowners obviously, but anybody who's interested, well, Butte County Resource Conservation District.
Lori?
In other states like Idaho, Montana, Washington, do they have a different take on controlled fires, prescribed fires?
There's a really strong culture of burning in the southeast, so North Carolina, South Carolina, the pine forest down there. The Nature Conservancy has a lot of land down there and they burn. So a lot of firefighters go out to the East Coast in the winter and work on burn crews out there. We got a chance to go out and burn with Clemson University has a real strong fire program. And they we worked with them on all these Klamath River treks, and they had us out last year to burn with treks, the southern Blue Ridge Mountains. But there's a real strong culture there. There's really good liability protection for private burn bosses on those. Where like in a lot of those states, in a lot of states across the whole country really, there's kind of laws that if you become a certified prescribed burn boss, and you don't have to be a firefighter necessarily to do that, unless you have real gross negligence, if you have a signed burn plan and it escapes, you're not liable for the property damage. And so it's a really hard thing here in California to get someone who's willing to take the risk to do a burn, where if you lose it, you could be on hook for millions of dollars. So there's a lot of push right now legislatively in California to reform the liability laws around prescribed burning.
Thanks, Zeke.
All right, thank you.